My hose grows longer every day. And no, that's not a euphemism. I'm literally talking about my garden hose, the one I ordered from Amazon, attached to the spigot by our deck. At first, I didn't really notice it. Like a frog in slowly boiling water, the changes were so incremental, I didn't realize what was happening. A few weeks after buying the hose, it was a little easier to reach the kale patch at the far end of our garden. A few weeks after that, I could do it without pulling the hose taut. I think the first time I really noticed it was about 2 weeks ago. I realized that, while watering the kale, the hose wasn't even in a straight line. It was all twisted and looped around the garden. What? Did you put in a new hose or something? I asked my wife, even though I knew the chances of her doing so were approximately 0. No. Why? I shook my head. It just seems different, never mind. I grabbed a tape measure and walked back outside. I knew I'd bought a 25-foot hose. I stretched the hose out in a near-perfect line, then kneeled in the damp grass, starting to measure it. "What are you doing?" I glanced back to see Sarah standing behind me. "I'm, measuring the hose." "Why?" "Thinking about putting in another raised bed over there," I said, pointing past the kale. "Another one?" "Maybe." She lingered for a moment, sighed, and walked back inside. As soon as she was out of sight, I went back to measuring. I couldn't believe it. The hose measured 32 feet, 4 inches. No. Maybe the manufacturer measured wrong. Maybe I got a defective one. But I couldn't deny it. I knew it seemed to be growing longer and longer. Every day, I could reach a little bit further into the backyard. I stepped back and took a photo of it. That night, I didn't roll it up, I left it stretched out in a line, with the terminus a few feet past the edge of the garden bed. The next morning, I took another picture, and compared them. My blood ran cold. The end of the hose was about 6 inches past where it was in the first photo. "It's growing." "No. That sounded crazy. A garden hose, growing?" I ran back in and grabbed the tape measure. Got on my hands and knees, measured. 32 feet, 9 inches. "Sarah," I told my wife, finally. "You're going to think I'm crazy, but I think our hose is growing." "Huh? Look. See?" I flipped through the 2 photos on my phone, showing her the difference. The hose is longer in that one. I measured it, too. 5 inches. She gave me a look. Like I was acting totally insane. I tried to tell her a few more times, but she didn't believe me. A few days passed, and I started to panic. At the beginning, the hose seemed to only be growing by the inch, just a little easier to reach the kale patch every day. Now it was growing by the foot. For Pete's sake, it nearly reached the woods now. I brought Sarah out and forced her to measure the hose. She was annoyed, but I didn't care. "If you do this, and you still don't believe me, I won't bring it up anymore." "Okay. 37 feet, 3 inches. Write it down." "What?" "Or email it to yourself, or something. Don't forget that number." She gave me another look, but wrote down the number on the fridge whiteboard. The next morning, I made her come out with me, and measure it again. Her eyes went wide as she read off the number. 39 feet, 8 inches. "See? I told you, but that's impossible." Maybe I measured wrong. By more than 2 feet? She just shook her head. We stared at each other for a moment, not sure what to say. Not willing to speak into words this ridiculous thing, that made no logical sense. Let's just get rid of it," she said, finally. We walked over to the hose bib. I bent down to unscrew it. The plastic of the hose felt strangely warm in my hands. Even though this part of the house was in shadow most of the day. I twisted once. Twice. 3 times. "It stuck on," I said, my heart starting to pound. Sarah ran inside. She came out with her huge chef's knife. And without a word, my 5 feet 2 inches wife, who's never shown aggression towards anyone or anything, knelt down and began hacking away at it. "Sarah." "Got it," she said, handing me the end of the hose. "Now get rid of it." "I guess I'll just throw it out." "No. Garbage day isn't until Thursday. Put it in a dumpster, or drop it in the woods, or something." Both of those things were semi-illegal, but Sarah was right. We weren't going to have this hose in a garbage bag in our garage for a few days. I imagined it growing and growing, stretching the plastic of the bag, until it broke free, slithered up the stairs, and strangled us in our sleep. "I'll dump it somewhere." I started for the driveway. "John." I turned around. Sarah's hands were covered in blood. "Did you cut yourself?" I dropped the hose and helped her inside. Put her hands under the faucet. The rust-colored water swirled down the drain. But when the water had washed the blood away, there wasn't a cut. Her hands were perfectly fine. I walked back out to the driveway, picked up the hose, and started for the car. That's when I noticed it. The hose was bleeding. Well, not really, but there was some dark liquid at the cut end that was smearing off on my hands too. It was dark and reddish-brown, rust, not blood. Because that would be ridiculous, blood coming from a hose. But when I brought the cut section up to my face, I saw something was wrong with it, horribly wrong. The plastic cross-section, which should have been green like the exterior of the hose, was instead a deep reddish-brown, like the liquid. And it wasn't uniform, it was striated with pinkish streaks. Almost like meat?
No. That was ridiculous. Just some new plastic they're using. Lots of hoses use recycled plastic on the interior, and a new layer on the inner and outer layers to prevent chemical leaching. That's the recycled plastic. Of course it's a weird color, of course it isn't uniform. It's all melted and cobbled together. I threw the hose into the trunk. Then I drove around, but it looked like all the dumpsters at various shopping centers were either locked or cordoned off with chain-link fence. So I drove to a nearby park, walked a quarter-mile into the woods, and dumped it off there. Which was littering, but at that point, I didn't care. I thought that was the end of our troubles. That we'd never see the hose again, and everything would go back to normal. I even thought it was more likely that we'd find ourselves in the plot of some B-rate horror movie, the hose slithering out of the woods like a snake, intent on strangling us to death. What actually happened was far worse. Sarah got the symptoms first. Intense stomach pain and chills. Then it was me, running a dangerously high fever. We rushed to the ER, and the doctor told us the horrible news. All the symptoms line up with intestinal parasites. And I can't help but think about all the produce we ate from the garden, watered with that hose. It was a crazy theory. A parasite couldn't be absorbed by a plant and then show up again in the fruit and eaten. But I can't stop picturing water flowing through that tube of what looked like meat. Watering our food. Suffusing into our bodies. Contaminating us with something unknown.